Hi everyone. In this video we're going to discuss the second chapter from The Logic of Sense by Gilles Deleuze, which is titled Second Series of Paradoxes of Surface Effects. Deleuze begins by introducing the Stoics by saying that they also distinguish between two different types of things. One type of thing he calls bodies. Bodies aren't just organic bodies, they're anything that has volume, mass, extension. He says that bodies have tensions, physical qualities, actions, and passions, and states of affairs, how bodies relate to each other. Bodies also have depth. So you can look at the body that's delivering this video and you see the surface, and inside in the depth there's organs, there's muscles, blood, tissue, cells, molecules, atoms, etc. So there's all kinds of mixtures of other bodies going on in the depths of the body you see here. The other kinds of things he calls events, and by contrast events are incorporeal, and body and events do not exist in depth. They only exist on the surface. Each of these kinds of things has its own form of time. Bodies only exist in the present. Theirs is a succession of present moments. And then he goes into he gets a little bit mystical by saying the accumulation of all these present moments he calls destiny. Whereas events never exist in the present. They elude the present. When an event occurs, it immediately divides and splits and goes into the future infinitely and the past infinitely at the same time. And he calls these infinitives. Which is similar to what he called in the last chapter, infinite identity of events. And he'll circle around to this and talk about it later in the book. But the type of time for events which only exist in the future and past simultaneously, that kind of time he calls the ion, whereas the time that is just a succession of present moments he calls chronos. The other thing he brings in is causality. Bodies are causes, events are effects. Okay, so events can be causes for other events. He calls those quasi-causes because they're really caused by bodies but through events. And he also introduces freedom. He says freedom is preserved in two kinds of ways. The first way, he says, in the interiority of the present moment, without really explaining it a lot. And then the second way, that would be sort of more the freedom through bodies, but the freedom entailed by events, he brings in another school of ancient Greek philosophy called the Epicureans, saying that the Epicureans viewed events much the same way the Stoics did. And he introduces the term klinamen, spelled C-L-I-N-A-M-E-N, and there's a footnote attached to that. When you look at the footnote, he talks about a Epicurean philosopher named Lucretius. And Lucretius was the name he came up with the term klinamen. And this is the name he gave to the unpredictable swerve of atoms in order to defend the doctrine of Epicurus, the atomistic doctrine of Epicurus. According to Lucretius, it's the klinamen that introduces free will. So we see that Deleuze has introduced free will into the proceedings here. And just as an aside, we find James Joyce alluding to this free will at the very beginning of Finnegan's Wake. The first sentence reads, "A river run past Eve and Adams, from swerve of shore to bend of bay." Okay. So this new duality of bodies or states of affairs and effects or incorporeal events entails an upheaval in philosophy. Deleuze says the Stoics are the first ones through this to reverse Platonism. According to Deleuze, Plato, there's a debate in the depths in Plato's philosophy whether any particular thing adheres to the model, the ideal form of that thing. So it's the difference between the ideal form and copies. Is the copy close enough to the ideal form to be called that? Is this chair have enough of the ideal form of chairness to be truly called a chair? And I feel it is. It's very comfortable. So this kind of thing, this consideration, whether it's close enough of a copy, is in the depths. It's not on the surface. On the surface, this is just a chair. So what the Stoics do is that they affirm all that is not fixed under the ideal form. Deleuze says that all of this that doesn't belong to the ideal form now returns to the surface. The unlimited returns, that which is not limited by the ideal form. Becoming mad, becoming unlimited is no longer a ground which rumbles. In other words, it's not something that has no place because it doesn't conform to an ideal form. It climbs to the surface of things and becomes impassive. Everything that eludes the ideal form becomes an effect on the surface and now represents all possible ideality. So you can see the reverse here, whereas before it was ideal forms that basically determined how we view things, and now what doesn't exist under these ideal forms is what Deleuze is calling ideality. That's the reversal. He says the most concealed becomes the most manifest. All the old paradoxes of becoming must again take shape in a new youthfulness, transmutation. And I think it's important to insert here that the book was published in 1969, meaning Deleuze wrote this in the late 60s when there was a lot of hope that there was going to be real changes, new becomings that changed how we live and how we see the world. Returning to the Stoics, Deleuze says it's necessary to read the brief portrait of a Stoic named Chrysippus, which was given in a book called Lives of Philosophers by Diogenes Laertius, and I'm probably butchering the pronunciation, excuse me. This portrait is only 1 or 2 pages, and it can be found online, and I'll provide a link in the description. But we find out from reading this that the Stoics were inventors of paradoxes, although Deleuze calls them amateurs at it, because when you read the portrait, you see their paradoxes are kind of joking. It almost seems they're sort of like almost like Zen koans. But we find out that Chrysippus was a master dialectician. And here we see now Deleuze is connecting the special kinds of things called events. He's connecting that with language. This is the first time he'll say that events correspond with verbs in language. So dialectics, Deleuze says, is precisely this science of incorporeal events as they are expressed in propositions, and of the connections between events as they're expressed in relations between propositions, okay? The conventional definition of dialectics is inquiry into metaphysical contradictions and their solutions. Dialectical thinking refers to the ability to view issues from multiple perspectives and to arrive at the most economical and reasonable reconciliation of seemingly contradictory information and postures. And Deleuze repeats what he said in the first chapter, which is that it's language that causes limitations, but it's also through language that we can transcend these limitations. And he's slowly getting us into a consideration of language, which he'll dive deep into in the following chapter, in chapter 3. He mentions something that Chrysippus says, which paradox, which is when Chrysippus, when he says the word chariot, a chariot passes through his lips. And it's interesting because if you read the portrait that I linked to, in that translation, he says the word wagon. A wagon passes through his lips. The reason it's interesting to me is because chariot is also it's a tarot card that, according to Thelema, is the archetype of the chariot is the formula of this new age that we are in right now. And there actually was someone who said chariot, and the doctrine of the chariot passed through his lips. And Deleuze compares this to both Zen, the sort of paradoxes of Zen, and also to American or English nonsense. And he talks about a little bit about paradox. He says paradox appears as a dismissal of depth, and he connects paradox with humor. And this is another reason he likes the Stoics, is because he says the Stoics, with the Stoics, humor found its dialectics and its pure philosophical concept. So later, several chapters on, he'll have a whole chapter dedicated to humor. And for me, it's one of the most important ones in the book. Humor is an extremely important concept in Deleuze's philosophy. And if you look at a lot of sort of the people that he connects with, like, for instance, James Joyce, they're extremely funny. There's actually a lot of humor in Deleuze's writings, too, if you can figure it out. He says, humor is the art of the surface. He'll again explore that idea later. And he opposes that to irony. He calls that Socratic irony, the art of the depths and the heights. So after that, he then circles back to Lewis Carroll, and he illustrates how Stoic concepts, how Lewis Carroll used Stoic concepts and influences in his work, and he gives a few examples. He makes the comment, it is by following the border. So here, the border is between, now he's slowly getting into this, the border is between things, between bodies and events. That's the surface. It is by following the border, by skirting the surface, that one passes from bodies to the incorporeal. Okay, then Deleuze goes on to mention another work by Lewis Carroll called Sylvie and Bruno. He says, this important novel pushes to the extreme the evolution which had begun in Alice in Wonderland and continued in Through the Looking Glass. Deleuze says that in the story of Sylvie and Bruno are two fairies, and there's this constant duality going on between the world of magic and the world we normally know, what we would call the real world, or the world of phenomena, not the magic world. He says in Sylvie and Bruno, the technique of passing from reality to dream and from bodies to the incorporeal is multiplied, completely renewed, and carried out to perfection. So in other words, passing between the regular, common, everyday world and the world of magic. This technique is given a lot in Sylvie and Bruno. I highly recommend reading it, and we'll leave it there and see you next time. Thank you.